Hi there! Last time you saw me do the last strip on the hull, or actually on the bottom of the hull. I have the whole upside still left. But I can't do that now, so what am I going to do now? I'm going to fill all the gaps in the hull. As you can see, I've been doing a little bit of gap filling here, as I needed to do that to strengthen the hull to get the strips to comply with the shape I have. But the next step afterwards is actually to sand everything, and to be able to sand everything you need to have the strips secured in place. So I need to fill all these small voids, the gaps between the strips, with epoxy, or actually thickened epoxy. So that is what I'm going to do now, and for epoxy work I dress up. So you don't want to have any exposed skin, as there are a little bit of faint odor from the epoxy. I usually use a mask.
For mixing epoxy, I get high enough precision by using a balance. The proportions between base and hardener for this brand is 100 to 55. I like the NM275A system, as it's made for hand application in low room temperature. Now I have 100 gram of base. To avoid spillage, I wipe off the opening. Now I need 55 grams of hardener. This is an amine adduct with a faint aromatic smell. Thus, it's good with the mask. From experience, I have noticed that plus minus 1 gram is good enough. If you are off by more than 5 gram, the laminate may not cure properly. First, I tumble mix in a round bucket. About 1 minute of mixing is good enough. Then I transfer the half mixed portion to the square bucket. And as the liquid is viscous, it takes some time to transfer. I use this time to prepare the cheap single-use pencil. It loses hair like a dog at springtime. Epoxy is expensive, so I transfer all, although the supplier recommends to leave what's on the sides. I haven't noticed any inferior laminate by transferring all. I get a wetted pencil and thus less waste. In a square bucket I use a different mixing pattern. Now to the actual topic of today's episode. To get the gaps filled, the angle of the strokes is important. Working in 45 degrees angle scraps the epoxy from the pencil into the gaps. I return until the gaps are fully filled. As I have removed most staples in this row, I also strike the row. Down by the edge, I avoid drops on the floor by changing the angle. Also, where I have previously filled the gaps, I do a second pass. As some epoxy has soaked up, I need to add more. I use unthickened epoxy on the vertical sides. I will use a more viscous mix for the horizontal areas with vertical gaps. The rather liquid mix penetrates well into the horizontal gaps. It can also be used to overfill parts where I have hardened epoxy since before. Now I mix a new batch, but this time I use NM Filler 51. This additive contains cotton fibers, making the epoxy more viscous. A mixture looking like wall paste, which will stay better in the vertical gaps. Otherwise the epoxy could make its way through the gaps down to the floor. It isn't necessary with epoxy outside the gaps, so I use a rubber putty to get excess down into the gaps. Here you see a bigger gap that I will need to treat in a special way. I prepare a new batch of thickened epoxy. This time I also add sawdust to the mixture. It will not make the mixture much thicker. But it will fill the bigger gap with something looking like wood. If you do not paint the surface, this is a trick to get a better appearance. On this side I have left most staples in place. It's a good idea to not smear epoxy on the staples. In the next episode you will understand why. I hope to see you back here then.